Denmark's Prime Minister has said he intends to postpone a meeting with his Turkish counterpart due to the ongoing diplomatic row between Turkey and the Netherlands and Turkey's criticisms of Dutch officials. As tensions between Turkey and the Netherlands boil over, a Turkish protester replaced a Dutch flag with the Turkish one at the Dutch consulate in Istanbul on Sunday. Consulates in both countries have now been closed following the Netherlands' decision to prevent the Turkish foreign minister from landing there. He was seeking to enter the Netherlands to gain support among Turkish expatriates for extending the president's powers. The Turkish Family Affairs Minister has also been ordered to leave the country. She described the move as a human rights violation.
We were subjected to inhumane, immoral treatment. This behavior is an infringement of human rights and democracy. They have limited our freedoms and restricted our right of movement. All of our rights were violated.
With more on the dispute, here's Charlotte Dubinsky.
Well, this diplomatic tensions between Turkey and here in the Netherlands seems to be escalating. You might just be able to hear there's a man just behind me shouting at the moment, expressing his anger about the fact that two Turkish ministers were not allowed to come to the Turkish consulate here in Rotterdam on Saturday. We've heard now from the Dutch Prime Minister that the reason he didn't allow those ministers to come to Rotterdam on Saturday is because he was under pressures and he felt that he was being blackmailed by the Turkish government in Ankara.
Turkey is a proud nation. The Netherlands is a proud nation. We can never do business under those sorts of threats and blackmail.
Strong words there from the Dutch Prime Minister, but there have also been strong words from the Turkish Foreign Minister, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, who has likened the Dutch Parliament to a remnant of the Nazi regime. And we've also been hearing very strong views today from the Turkish President, Erdogan.
Hey, Holland. If you are sacrificing Turkish-Dutch relations for the sake of the elections on Wednesday, you will pay a price. You will pay a price.
And that's echoing what we heard from the Turkish Foreign Minister today in France. Now, we had heard him previously say he just wanted an apology from the Dutch government over that event. However, today he told reporters an apology isn't enough. He's allowed to go to that rally in France, but rallies here in Holland were cancelled yesterday, and 4 rallies in Austria and also one in Switzerland was also cancelled. Fears that it would incite violence that we saw on Saturday night here outside the consulate, but very strong opinions, and we are expecting more people to come out today and say how unhappy they are about the fact that Turkish ministers were not allowed to come here to the Netherlands.
The dispute between Turkey and EU countries has cast doubt over last year's migrant deal. Under the agreement, for every Syrian refugee returned to Turkey from the Greek islands, the EU has to give asylum to 1 Syrian refugee from Turkey. The plan saw a 98% drop in migrants crossing from Turkey. Now, let's bring in Mark Ullman, Director of the Crisis Research Institute in Oxford. Mark, thanks for joining us here on RT. Now, let's start with your take on the Dutch PM's move.
Well, I think we must remember that before this blew up on Friday night and through Saturday, in fact, Mark Rutte and his supporters had been increasingly engaging in a Dutch nationalist campaign at home to counter the threat to them from Geert Wilders' openly nationalistic party. So we have, if you like, Dutch nationalism playing its role in the internal run-up to the Dutch election on Wednesday, but we also have, of course, the referendum campaign in Turkey itself, which is spread across Europe because so many Turkish citizens live abroad. And so we have 2 campaigns, each has an interest in stirring up nationalism. The great problem is they've now collided, and that, of course, has European-wide connotations and consequences, which I think are going to outlive the actual immediate cause, which is electioneering.
And what's your view on the fact that democratic principles are under pressure, are being compromised?
Well, it is a very complicated question, isn't it? On the one hand, if you allow joint citizenship, then you're going to have a situation where people will be concerned about the politics in the country in which they live, but also the country we might call their home country, the other country where they have citizenship. So it's not entirely improbable that therefore you're going to have party political campaigning, referendum campaigning outside, in this case, Turkey. The problem, of course, for the Dutch government, for instance, is that it has permitted, and so have the Germans and the Austrians, some campaigning by critics of President Erdogan, by groups that don't particularly want his referendum proposals to pass, but they've said you can't have meetings addressed by his ministers. In the Dutch case, they have a kind of legal basis for saying that they don't allow foreign governments to play a role in politics. In the German, Austrian, Swiss case, they've tended to use arguments that the venues aren't safe and so on. That may be true, but it may be an excuse. And it's certainly poisoning the atmosphere. Though we also have to remember that we have sharp divisions amongst the Turkish citizens who live in these countries, because by no means all of them support President Erdogan. For instance, those of Kurdish origin tend very strongly to be against his proposals. So we do have the risk of intra-Turkish tensions in these countries like the Netherlands, as well as tensions between the governments of those countries and the Turkish government. And of course also we have other groups like, for instance, Moroccans and North Africans in the Netherlands. After all, the mayor of Rotterdam himself is a Muslim, of Muslim origin, but from North Africa, and he is supporting the Dutch government's stance. So we have a very complex mix of nationalism, national identity, citizenship, religious identity, regional identities. It's a huge mess, and it's a very dangerous one too.
Yeah, it seems very complex, but also seems that things aren't being allowed across the board, are they, in a fair manner? So why do you think, people would be looking at this situation now, and it seems that Europe is intent on blocking Turkish officials from speaking at rallies? Why is there this impression? And if this is indeed the case, why are they doing it?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, certainly, it's almost a consensus across the European Union countries, certainly the West European Union countries, that President Erdogan has got too big for his boots, that he has responded to the failed coup by becoming more authoritarian, and they would ideally like him to lose the referendum and therefore for his power base to be chipped back. There's that aspect. And it's fairly obvious that I think this could backfire in Turkey, that many Turks will rally to the government simply because they don't want to be pushed around by the European Union countries. There's also these internal issues, because in addition to the Dutch election coming up in a few days, we have, of course, elections in Germany, where again, you have a large expatriate population from Turkey and other countries, and it's becoming part of the local politics. And there aren't just extreme right-wing groups like Wilders in the Netherlands, whose parties trying to capitalise on the tensions about migration and so on. There are also more, I think, respectable conservative parties like Mr. Rutte's in the Netherlands, Angela Merkel, CDU in Germany, that are beginning to say everybody should become really Dutch, really German, people should abandon their roots. Now that, of course, stokes up some tension with people from recent migrant communities. And the Turkish issue has become, if you like, the touchstone of this internal politics too, and precisely because we have an external factor, including, as you've mentioned, the Syrian refugees and the attempts by the Europeans, if you like, to buy off the Turks by giving them considerable grants in order to prevent people crossing to Europe. But you have then the issue of Turkey itself and its desire to join the EU, but it's clear signs that it's not going to be a very comfortable partner. And then increasingly, the domestic politics of countries like Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, where politicians guess that their populations, their voters, don't really want an expanded the EU, not least don't want it expanded to Turkey, and they are playing up to those fears and to those points of view, and it's a very combustible mix.
Yeah, well, we're just going to have to wait and see where this diplomatic spat leads us to. That's Mark Alman, Director of the Crisis Research Institute in Oxford. Thanks very much for your thoughts, Mark.